All right. Well, we've got a good number of folks here, and I know there'll be more folks coming along as we go along. So let's get started. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Jennifer Abel. I am the project officer with Portage, and I know I've met some of you out there, and for those of you I haven't met yet, hello, nice to meet you. Today's webinar is going to be presented by the Research Intelligence Expert Group within Portage, and it is on surveying institutional preparedness for research data management. Just a few housekeeping things as we go forward. And I'm just going to switch over here so I can actually see my slides. There we go. Some housekeeping things. You'll be muted automatically when you enter the room. I will be able to unmute you later on when we get into the Q&A sessions and the discussion session. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features. If you are being told to upgrade now, maybe wait until afterwards. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or additional resources to share, and you may want to make sure that you've got it set to sending to all panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see it. Please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. We'll have a quick Q&A session towards the end of this webinar. We also have the option for people to answer questions among themselves. So if you feel inclined to do that, please feel free. You can also raise your hand if you have a question. There is a hand raising feature because if you raise your hand like this, I won't be able to see you. Questions may be asked in English or French. We will do our best to answer them. Well, we'll probably answer them in English, but we'll do our best to answer them in French to the best of our ability. We do have a code of conduct for participating in CARL events. You can find the complete code of conduct at carl.abrc.ca/CARL Code of Conduct. We are committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for staff, membership committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of CARL meetings and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. So if you're into that, go away. Now, for the presenters. We have 3 presenters today. Alex Cooper is the Data Services Coordinator at Queen's University. She's a member of RIG, which is the Research Intelligence Expert Group, as I mentioned, Dataverse North, and the Canadian RDM Survey Consortium. She is also a member of the Oakland, Ontario Data Community and serves as Chair of Statistics Canada's DLI Professional Development Committee. A busy woman. Another busy woman is Dylan Dearborn, who's the RDM Coordinator of University Toronto Libraries. She's been part of Portage since 2016 and is currently a member of RIG and the Canadian RDM Survey Consortium, and she's a member of the iAssist Administrative Committee. And Shahira Kher is the data curation librarian, I think for as the, because I work with her all the time, at University of Victoria Libraries, and she's the chair of the RIG group. She currently holds a part-time secondment with Canada's new Digital Research Infrastructure Organization, and DRIO, as a senior analyst supporting assessment and strategic planning initiatives. They're all very, very busy. They've all been working really hard on this project. We're really thrilled to have them here today with us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Shahira, who is going to get things started. And yeah.
It's going to be Dylan getting things started.
It's going to be Dylan getting things started. It's going to be, yeah, which is even better. No, it's not even better. It's equally good.
So thank you all for joining us. As Jennifer mentioned, today we'd like to talk to you about some of the work being conducted to survey institutional preparedness for research data management by the Research Intelligence Expert Group. So next slide, Jen. First, we'd like to run a quick poll. So you should see something pop up. We just want to learn a bit about where everyone's coming from. So just select the category that best describes your institution, and we'll give you a few seconds to fill this out. Okay, Jen, are we good with responses? Thank you. Okay, it seems like we have a lot of people attending that come from universities, but we do have some diversity in our attendance, which is great. And this will help us going forward to engage with the rest of the conversation. Okay, so next slide, Jen. So our objectives for today are to share some of the key results from 2 recent surveys that were sent out to Canadian institutions and listservs. First, we'll have Shahira speak about the Institutional RDM Strategy Survey, and next we'll have Alex speak about the Institutional RDM Capacity Survey. We also hope that this will lead into a discussion with all of you to dig a little deeper into what is important to you and your institution related to some of the results and how we can move forward with this engagement. Next slide. So a little background on the Research Intelligence Expert Group, which we'll call REIG. The purpose of REIG is to provide oversight of specific studies that gather evidence and produce reports on RDM topics of national interest. To do this, REIG developed a roadmap to help form direction for the REIG activities. The roadmap identified gaps in our knowledge of RDM, including practices, developments, culture, and policies in Canada. From the roadmap, we identified 2 gaps that were of particular interest, and we formed working groups to determine a way to start to bridge these specific gaps. Next slide. So the first gap identified was that there was a gap in information related to RDM policies and strategic planning within research organizations and post-secondary institutions in Canada. The working group tasked with examining this gap developed a survey to assess the current status of efforts to develop RDM strategies in Canadian research institutions. So this survey went out in June 2019, and you can access the summary of results later via the links on the side. Next slide. The second gap identified was a need to understand institutional capacity as well as local and national capacity for RDM. The working group tasked with examining this gap developed a survey to assess RDM infrastructure, services, resources, staffing, and regional and national engagement at Canadian institutions. This survey was a little bit longer and went out in October 2019. And again, you can access the executive summary report later via the links on the side of the slide. Next slide. So just a second poll, if Jen, you want to put that up. We would like to know if any of you recall filling out either of these surveys. So we'll just give you a moment to fill that out once it pops up. Jen says the results are emerging. So just close that whenever it seems that we're good on results, Jen. Thanks, that's really useful to know going into the discussion and the next pieces, which, next slide. So going through some of the stuff in the surveys. For each survey, we'd like to highlight some of the findings, discuss some of the barriers and challenges, and provide some next steps. So I'm going to pass off to Shahira to discuss the first set of results.
Thanks, Dylan. So yeah, it looks like about half of the participants were not engaged in responding to either of these surveys. So I'll spend a bit of time going through them in a bit more detail. So as Dylan said, the first survey that REIG ran was targeted specifically on looking at progress being made by institutions in responding to that first pillar of the tri-agency's draft research data management policy, which is requiring an institutional strategy for supporting researchers with research data management. And so the results I'm about to present reflect progress made by respondents as of June of last year. So they're about a year old now. And we had 63 different institutions represented in our responses. Next slide. So as you can see, we had pretty good participation regionally. Most of our responses came from universities. We had 13 out of 15 of the U15 universities respond, and about half of all Universities Canada members responded. In other institution types, there's weaker response rates. So outside of Quebec, colleges are not represented in this first survey. And we also received a few responses from research centers and government agencies who may partner on research projects funded by the tri-agency. Next. So hopefully the figure here is not too small to read on your screens. But the central question of the survey assessed what stage of development institutions found themselves in terms of creating these strategies. And respondents were given the option of checking multiple stages, assuming that some of these actions could be done concurrently. And so encouragingly, most of the institutions who responded had started some action towards developing one of these strategies. Less than a third had not yet started any action. Oh, yeah, just back. And yeah, so most institutions, yes, so this slide, most institutions were in the early stages of developing the strategies. So reviewing available materials, many had formed working groups, and many were also assessing current capacity. The further along the development ladder you go, the number of institutions reaching those stages declines dramatically. And at that time, only one institution had posted a strategy. I can see Daniel Beaulieu is asking about CR Kanban, which I'm about to get to. So one of our questions going into this survey was whether institutional size would have any sort of relationship to the development of these strategies, thinking perhaps that larger institutions would have either more awareness or more capacity to kind of anticipate and respond to the draft policy. So we broke out institutions according to CR Kanban, and CR Can stands for the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. They have a banding system which measures research and teaching intensity, with 1 being low and 13 being high. And so you can see we didn't find much of a relationship between that measure and how far along institutions were in developing these strategies. So next slide, Jen. Another thing that we looked at in this survey was what sort of resources respondents were turning to develop these strategies. Most respondents were using the Portage template and guidance document, which were well reviewed by all of the respondents to this survey. As well, about half of the respondents indicated that their strategies are drawing from existing institutional policies. So of course, most institutions should already have some related policies, perhaps dealing with research ethics, intellectual property, research information management. And that's one area that the capacity survey explores in more detail, and is something that REIG is planning to do some more research on in the near future. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of challenges and obstacles that respondents indicated, one takeaway from looking at the comments was that the uncertainty around when the final policy would be announced may be one factor impeding progress. So many institutions are being cautious and don't necessarily want to get too far ahead of the policy, which could be one explanation for why many institutions are bulked together in those early development stages. Another challenge respondents indicated was translating the kind of high-level goals of the strategy into actions. So going from a high-level strategy into a more specific roadmap or action plan, respondents are looking for more kind of specific examples of actions they can implement to support researchers with data management. And then finally, the complexity of the ecosystem also arose in responses. So researchers draw on many resources. Not all of those are provided by the institution that they are, working for. And so where institutions fit into this equation was one area that respondents were dealing with. So we do have plans to run this survey again after the tri-agency policy has been announced. So it will be interesting to see how some of these findings might change. And with that, I will turn it over to Alex, who's going to review some of the responses from our capacity survey.
Thanks, Shahir. So the institutional RDM services capacity survey was developed to gather information on institutions' existing services and capacity to support research data management. The survey included questions on developing and allocating human, organizational, and infrastructure and fiscal resources and coordinating multiple units within institutions, as well as national and regional efforts. Respondents were also asked to identify barriers, challenges, and accelerators to further improve RDM services. So we ran that in October of 2019, and we had 77 institutions responded. Next slide. Across the 4 regions across Canada, we had somewhat good representation. 52 universities, which is about half of the Canadian universities, and 21 colleges or CEGEPs responded to the survey. And we were actually quite excited to see that a number of colleges had responded, since we didn't have any responses from the previous survey. And just a brief note that as I go through this presentation, I will be just referring to colleges, but I actually mean colleges and CEGEPs together. Next slide, please. So we started with asking about asking respondents if their institutions had an RDM policy. In the questionnaire, we defined strategy as a guidance or principle and required by the emerging tri-agency policy, and policy as a more formal and comprehensive requirement directing institutional actions. So as we can see, 55 of the 77 institutions responded that they currently have no policy. However, there are a few that are working on them. Of the 6 that do currently have a policy, 2 are colleges, 2 are universities, and 2 were research centers or government organization. Next slide. Looking at collaboration, we then asked respondents to identify departments across campus by current involvement in RDM support and services. Senior administration, research administrative bodies, library, and IT departments were among the leading or participating in RDM services in a majority of cases. Externally, institutions are actively involved in a number of regional and national collaborations, and this was quite a high response in terms of regional and national collaboration. This is demonstrating a recognition that collaborative ventures in RDM will help accelerate the development of support and services to benefit organizations of all sizes. Next slide, please, Jen. Looking at staffing, we asked the institutions to name any RDM positions that were created or reassigned recently due to RDM. For each of the categories, about 1/3 of the institutions had either created new positions, reassigned people, or made RDM part of a position, or do not have any RDM positions assigned right now. This was a write-in question, and we asked respondents to name to provide the job titles. We then took that and coded it into these categories. Next slide. So RDM support includes many services provided by groups within and outside of an institution. Listed here are the services that we asked about in the survey, and those are the ones listed on the left. And on the right are the groups that provide those services. Next slide, Jen. As we can see here, the library was one of the top RDM supporters through this survey, which, given the number of library responses we had, kind of makes sense. But the highlighted ones are the most frequent services that the library is supporting. So the information websites, advisory services, best practices, DMP training, hands-on workshops, and curation support. Next slide, please. For IT departments, the majority of the respondents noted that IT is providing technical and data computing services. There were a few responses for some of the other services, but it was primarily these two. Next slide. National resources, in addition to the libraries, were reported to largely support websites and general RDM best practices or DMP training. And the next slide. And lastly, all the institutions reported that they were planning to provide each of the services that were listed in the questionnaire. However, at least 20 of the 77 institutions reported that they were planning to provide 7 of the 8 services, with technical support, RDM best practices or DMP training, targeted hands-on RDM workshop, and curation support as the top 4 that were going to be provided. Next slide. Moving on to skill level, respondents were asked, different skills are needed for further support research data management. At what level are the following services available at your institution? And they could check all that applied. For most of these listed, institutions responded that the skills are partially available, but more was needed. Comparing the fully available, which is the dark blue bar, to the partially available, which is the light blue bar, we can see that there is an opportunity to invest in skills development to improve support for RDM. So in a lot of the institutions, the skill to provide the service is somewhat there, but they don't, respondents don't feel it's completely there yet. And the next slide, please. So we also asked about barriers and challenges. The institutions were able to choose all barriers and challenges that apply to them. Almost all of them had over 50% response rate, showing that many institutions are still seeing a number of barriers and challenges to supporting RDM and the fair practice principles. However, the absence of policies, guidelines, or coordination with regional and national level did not have a high response rate and was less than 40%, which is in line with the responses to question 24 that asked about external participation in RDM and showed a large number of institutions participating in both regional and national groups. And the next slide. So towards the end of the survey, we asked about the required resources to provide RDM services. In order to streamline RDM at the institution, human resources was most frequently identified as the most important required resource needed. This was followed by the need for policy guidance and financial and technical resources. Further reporting will examine the differences between institution size and type on this priority ranking, so we can get a better idea of where these required resources are needed. And the next slide, please. So coming up, what's next for our group is we're writing a series of insight reports that will look in more detail at all of the survey questions. And the first one, which will be out hopefully within the next month, will be on organization, collaboration, strategy, policy, and business and sustainability. And then the next 2 reports listed there will be coming out in a few months after that. And now I think we're going back to Shahira.
Alex. Yeah, so I just wanted to wrap up the presentation portion of the webinar by thanking you all for attending today. And by pointing you to our section on the Portage website, where you can find more information about the work that RIG is doing, or you can get in touch with us directly. So in addition to the insights reports that Alex mentioned, we're also planning a few projects on assessing institutional policies around research data management. We're also looking at how scholarly publishers are gearing up to support researchers with data management. And we'd love to hear your ideas for other areas that we should be gathering intelligence. So with that, I'll hand control back to Jen to lead the Q&A, where you can ask questions about what we've presented or share your own comments about how institutions are developing capacity for data management.
Okay, and I am going to stop sharing my screen now. So if you have any questions, we've got a couple here. Kevin Reed had asked about who specifically answered these surveys, and that looks like that's been answered. So if you're in the Q&A, you can see if people have answered questions, which is great. Thanks for the great question, Kevin.
Just to add a little bit, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Just to add a little bit, I think Ming Lu's providing the breakdown of responses to the capacity survey. So for the two surveys, responses did differ. The first survey on institutional strategies was kind of open to multiple responses, and because we weren't really sure, who the surveys would reach, and we wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. We also weren't really sure at that stage how coordinated institutions were in developing these strategies. So for that first survey, the response rate was kind of broken out 50% between respondents coming from the library or coming from research offices or research service departments. And then it's in the second survey, the larger capacity survey that Ming Lu is providing data for here, where we had kind of specifically requested that institutions try to provide a coordinated response. So whether they had formed a working group or had kind of, provided different actors from across the institution to provide input into a single survey.
Great. So we have a question from Felicity, and I think, Alex, this is going to be in your section, which is slide 27, asking if you could speak a bit more about the breakdown of specific financial support for RDM.
Yeah, so when we asked that question, we gave the example of support for researchers to use publishers' data management services. It's, I think we were heading towards financial support for researchers to do RDM. We didn't really get much more detail than that in the questionnaire.
Okay. Question from Isabel Laplante. Is one of the other survey inspired by the UK's DCC Research Infrastructure Self-Evaluation Framework, for which the URL is in the Q&A?
So speaking to the institutional strategy survey, no, not specifically. Yeah, the DCC's RISE framework is a really useful document. And so I'll let Alex comment specifically on the capacity survey. I know that the capacity survey was also based on an open access survey from the European University Association. I don't know if there were any other surveys that inspired some of those questions.
Yeah, that's right, Shahira. We did use that as a basis. We did look at that survey, but I don't believe we used much from it to help us form the questions.
I think just to kind of follow up on that a bit as well, I know that kind of the RISE framework can be used is stated as being useful for creating kind of institutional strategies or roadmaps. And so I think in future work where we're assessing different policies or roadmaps that will emerge once the policy from the tri-agency goes live, that could be a useful resource for kind of guiding that future work.
Great, thanks. A question from Joyce Thompson here. Were you able to see if there was any association between size of institution and creation of new positions, reassignment, etc.?
No, we haven't really looked at that part yet. I think That may come up in the next insight report, but we haven't looked at that yet.
Something to add to the list.
Yes.
Okay. 2 questions at a time here. Another one from Felicity. Thanks for doing this survey. 2-part question. How will Portage use this survey to build its own vision into the NDRIO? It's a good thing Jeff is here. And how do you imagine that institutions might be able to use this survey to advance their own institutional strategies or RDM service offerings? Ooh.
That's excellent. 2 excellent questions, Felicity. And I don't want to take it away from the RIG and their insights they may have from the survey. In terms of using this survey to build the vision into NDRIO, it's certainly going to feed into the current state assessment and the needs assessment that is underway during this 6 to 8 month period that we're in right now, where there is going to be a needs assessment, which Shahira and Guylaine Roquette from NDRIO and Research Data Canada and Portage are all involved in. So I think the results from this survey will highlight the pain points and pressure points for universities and colleges and other players for us to try and respond to with the suite of services that we carry forward into NDRIO. So absolutely, this informs that process. In terms of the individual institutions, I don't know why. I'd like to say it was Friday, and I'm punching from the week, but it's only Tuesday. My gut reaction, my initial reaction is it could inform this survey, or particularly this well, both surveys, in fact, could inform the composition of campus groups to convene to discuss research data management. So if you have a group on campus that, I don't know, does not have IT or research or ethics presence or participation, this could flag to you the importance of that. I think too, the fact that the survey, the second survey and the first survey, point to some measure of progress toward addressing RDM as an issue, maybe for some institutions a way of, and again, this is being recorded, so I have to be a bit careful, encouraging their administrators to take this seriously and move on it, because other institutions are not standing still. And so that's another perhaps benefit of these surveys. And I think too, they might inform areas where they might have strengths on their particular campus and they could bring something to the table in this space. So I suppose another question, which I'll just put out to the group, and I really should know the answer to this, but do we or have we started an inventory of finished, or shall we say posted, institutional RDM strategies? We have a few I know of just in the top of my head, but have we started gathering them together so we could point people to them?
So that's kind of part of the upcoming work. So at the moment, we're aware of certain ones that have been shared. I think the next step would be for us to kind of survey Portage members to see if their institutions have posted. And then once we get kind of a sufficient sample, then it would be something we're interested in to start evaluating them against a framework. And so it could be that these surveys in part inform that framework. So just adding more to kind of your answer to Felicity's question. And then, we're also very open to including other elements, as I alluded to in my kind of closing slide. If there's specific questions that this community is interested in that are not being addressed by these surveys, we're happy to take your feedback.
I'll just throw in one more item. In a meeting yesterday, which had tri-agency participation, and we all know that the tri-agency policy looms large. The latest estimate was fall of 2020, but it was not a very firm or convincing estimate of when the policy would be dropped. They're really not interested in having the policy go live in the middle of a national or global pandemic. So we could be looking at even longer delays. So we should take this as an opportunity to just bolster our ability to address the tri-agency's policies, while at the same time trying to maintain some measure of urgency and importance with our administrations and so on. So we don't want this to fall off the radar.
Great, thanks. So we have a French question here, which I am going to read. Pardonnez-moi. This is a question about the barriers and challenges that people are experiencing. This is from C. Leduc. Le défi du dépôt des données chez nous et en amont, les chercheurs n'ont pas demandé la permission aux répondants concernant le partage. Des idées comment faire changer cette pratique qui semble généralisée? So if researchers haven't asked their participants for permission to share their data, how can we share their data? Any suggestions for that people can apply broadly?
I mean, I think, one aspect of that speaks to the need for coordination across institutional stakeholders. So engaging research ethics departments during, a research ethics application review to flag, with the researcher if they're intending to share their data, if they want to share their data, if so, how that needs to be integrated from, the starting point of planning a project and getting consent from participants. So I think they're probably the most, best positioned people to help kind of change that practice. And so that could be, those conversations could take place in the context of a institutional strategy working group. Maybe that's a part of a strategy to kind of develop, more widespread practices around data sharing or finding ways of encouraging researchers to change those practices. I agree, once the project is completed, it's almost, in most cases, not reasonable to go back and ask participants to provide permission to share that data. So finding, upstream solutions, I think, is the best path forward.
I would just add to that in the same breath that we would like very much to have ethics represented on committees, campus committees, to look at institutional RDM strategies, I think it's an incredibly powerful way of reaching out to researchers for data specialists to serve in some capacity on, or at the very least make presentations to their various ethics boards on their campuses. So in an ideal world, there'd be an RDM sensitized data specialist who can then could serve on an ethics board and or inform ethics boards so that they're making the right decisions, and more important, making the right referrals to the data service for advice on how to construct deposit-friendly language around consent and deposit-friendly language around ethics applications, both of which are outputs that are coming, I've said this before, coming soon. I think it'll come out sooner than the RDM policy from the tri-agency, but coming soon to a Portage website near you. We'll have some guidance on that.
Et pouvez-vous répondre en français aussi, peut-être un précis?
Oui, dans le cadre des éthiques, là, ce serait probablement la meilleure chose, serait d'avoir non seulement les membres des panneaux d'éthique servir avec le monde sur les panneaux de gestion de données, mais avoir des experts de gestion de données, des données, servir sur les comités d'éthique, ou au minimum faire des présentations à des panneaux d'éthique avec le but de les sensibiliser vers je ne sais pas le phrase en français, informed consent, pour les éthiques, puis aussi pour les informed consent, les deux côtés, pour les répondants au sondage.
Consentement éclairé, apparently, is the term.
Consentement éclairé. Well, you learn something every day.
Merci, Jonathan.
And I think there's a sort of a related follow-up question with a bit of irony from Joyce. Will we be making the data from these surveys available to other researchers? Tiny bit of irony there. Did you hear it?
Yeah, I mean, so when we decided to run these surveys, we had agreed to take the approach of making the data confidential, given that, many institutions, we wanted, forthcoming responses from institutions. And so we have made kind of the metadata around the surveys, data dictionaries openly available, but the raw data files are currently not shareable, which is one reason why REIG is completely willing to do further analysis of these surveys if there's particular questions that are of interest to the community.
The data dictionary, which has its frequencies for each of the questions, is available in the executive summary, which Dylan showed on one of the slides in her section at the beginning of the presentation.
They're also available, a link was posted in the main chat to the REIG Portage page. Our reports are available linked on the REIG Portage page.
Great, thank you. A question from Keshav. Is there a plan, or would it be useful for REIG to investigate current departmental review, promotion, and tenure guidelines to see if there is language for valuing data management in them? Something like the Skullcom Lab project, which he's provided a link to here.
I think that's a great suggestion, and it could be, its own separate project, or it could be a part of kind of future work related to this survey. I know that in the capacity survey, one challenge that was one of the most frequently flagged was raising awareness of the value and importance of research data management. And certainly one measure of that is that being reflected in review, promotion, and tenure guidelines. I think that also in terms of providing specific practices to institutions to kind of guide implementation of supporting research data management. That's one strong recommendation that Portage and other national data management organizations could recommend. So that's a great question.
Excellent, thank you. Question from Jonathan Dory. Based on the data from both surveys, would you think institutions in Canada are ready at the moment, assuming the tri-agency policy was published today or shortly?
I mean, maybe. My understanding is that the policy is going to be phased in. So even when it's announced, there's going to be a window of opportunity to, release the strategy and then start requiring data management plans. So I think that there is quite a lot of awareness. That might be one, silver lining to the kind of prolonged period of the draft policy being announced, is that I think most institutions have become aware that this is something that they're going to be expected to do. Most institutions are aware of it as well. And then it's also part of kind of a broader culture shift. So, research publishers are also requiring more data to be deposited. So I think the ecosystem is kind of primed to take some quick action if it were to be announced soon.
Great. Another question here. For institutions that have completed their institutional strategies or policy on RDM, does Portage have any plan to track their RDM progress in actual implementation? It would be good to have success stories in Canada.
I think that's a good recommendation. We haven't really formed a plan yet to kind of start evaluating strategies and policies. I think I'm not really sure what to expect when it comes to these institutional strategies. I think the tri-agency has left it kind of open to institutions to kind of craft them as best fits their own kind of capacity. And so I think the roadmap element or action plan will be an interesting thing to evaluate. I'm not sure how specifically institutions are going to be making those roadmaps, if they're going to be higher level or if they're going to be describing specific actions they're going to take. But that's a great great suggestion.
I would just do a call out to any and all of you on the call that if you do know of success stories on your campuses, interactions between RDM and ethics, RDM and researchers and RDM, any combination of that in IT, we would very much welcome those because narratives often are the most powerful way of telling and selling the value of research data management to all and sundry. So I would certainly encourage you to note them if you've got them, and we will happily fold them into anything that we put out.
Great. So I'm not seeing any further questions at this time, but maybe this is a good time for our third poll, which sort of builds into all of this, which I'm going to launch now, which is, has your institution made progress in developing an RDM strategy in the last 12 months? Real-time election results are fascinating. We'll give it a few more seconds here. We've got some good. And we've got a question that's come out of this. Great, wonderful. Okay, interesting. So yes is winning, but there's still some no's and some not sure's.
I wonder if or how different the results would be if we asked in the last 3 months. I'm sure that I'm not alone in COVID derailing a lot of kind of progress on this file. I think what Felicity poses in the Q&A is a really good question and is something that kind of, I think Portage could perhaps provide some direction on. It's complicated work and institutions have many different priorities, especially now in this COVID environment. I think, libraries have been leaders on this file, as a lot of our survey results support. So it will probably be down to many of us to kind of push this file forward. I don't know if there's any kind of recommendations from the group or from other folks on the call.
I mean, if anything, bringing forward results like these may help open a conversation. If your research office, IT groups, whatever groups you're collaborating with, haven't seen results of national survey efforts, it might spark something that could engage a little bit more.
Yeah, and I see Michelle asks in the chat, yeah, I think we also need to define how much progress counts as progress, especially given the long timeline. It's been a year since we ran that first institutional strategy survey. So is progress actually having a strategy, or what does that actually look like? And then in terms of capacity, there's so much diversity across the country. It's hard to standardize something like that. So that's something to keep in mind.
I would also just flag to you, and I believe this happened yesterday, and Kathleen can come on if I'm wrong, but I believe we've just posted a new version of the template for the institutional RDM strategy. So if any of you have been working with the older version, it is still available on request if you want it, if you didn't download it. But a new version is posted now to the Portage website. And maybe we can pop a link into the chat. And it is largely the same as in terms of broad content and approach, but there have been some updates to it just to bring it into a more current frame of mind. So do look at that as well.
Okay, great. A couple more questions. Well, not a question, but a comment, but we can have responses to the comment. Many people who need to be involved in the development of the strategy are also involved in figuring how to move forward with COVID times. So we are a bit stalled due to this and really not much we can do to push from the library, which sounds like what Shihira, you were talking about. So if other people have thoughts about that, please feel free to share your responses with us. Shihira, you have something?
No, just empathy. That's how it is.
A bit more of a provocative question here from Guillaume. Am I the only one who wonders why the basic principles and the overall rationale behind RDM isn't clear except the editors ask for it and everybody else does it? Why isn't it embedded in responsible conduct of research in a broad view? But maybe I'm not close enough to the work being done on the issue. Interesting.
Well,
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, the tri-agency RDM policy, which has been in gestation longer than
Elephants.
longer than I've been in my role here at Portage, but certainly it first came out in largely the same broad structure and form in May of 2016. So that's telling you something. I think that has certainly informed a lot of that. So
I would also point to the statement of principles that precedes the draft policy, where the tri-agency kind of outlines the importance of data management and kind of roles for different stakeholders as being something that really supports the draft policy. I think, you know, within a lot of the library community, within research services, there's an understanding of why it's important to share data and be open and kind of transparent with research. I think that's starting to, you know, trickle down or to kind of come up actually from the bottom in different ways, you know, with the open science movement and movements to encourage reproducibility, which resonate, I think, a little more strongly with researchers than these kind of high level objectives. So I think there's kind of movement on both ends, but I think it's about kind of bridging those reasons for why we do this into kind of actual policies or statements that's challenging.
The other thing that I would just suggest to you is that I believe we've made really good progress. Culture change doesn't happen overnight, and the earlier question about tenure and promotion is an excellent one, and that's probably going to be one of the most powerful culture changes that we can bring into effect, and that will have a big impact, I think. But if you were to go back to and Alex, you can sort of give me a timeline here, but I believe that the consortium of survey conductors, if you will, on RDM, we're talking probably 3 or 4+ years ago that they were running those surveys. And I would submit to you that we've got probably a different environment today than we had then. When were they first conducted, Alex?
2015.
2015.
2015. So that's a full 5 years and counting. And I would suspect that if you went in and looked at some of the parallel questions from 2015 and the answers from researchers then and now, there would probably be, I would hope, some movement in the right direction. We still have a lot more work to do, though.
Great, thanks. So I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. So I'll ask the panelists, do you want to do one of our Padlets, or are you, we've got about 4 minutes left.
I'm not sure that's enough time to move to the Padlets. We had some kind of discussion questions to engage the audience, but there's been so many great questions and we've touched on some of those themes. I'm not sure we would do kind of that work justice, but perhaps that's something we can pose as part of the sharing the materials from the webinar, and then folks can always, you know, respond maybe in the Portage water coolers or other kind of
Yep.
Portage outreach methods.
All right. Any final words from any of the panelists or anyone else?
Just want to thank everyone for joining. I think we had almost 100 at the kind of peak, so that's really great to see so much enthusiasm for this work. We welcome your comments and thoughts on work that we can do. We're a super active expert group and have a lot of big plans. So if you're interested in learning more or becoming a part of this expert group, feel free to get in touch.
A big call out to the Research Intelligence Expert Group for all their work on this, and thank you. It is very much appreciated.
In that case, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This was a really great session. Thanks for all your great questions. And thanks very much to all of our panelists, Shahira Kerr, Alexandra Cooper, Dylan Dearborn, our honorary panelist, as always, Jeff Moon, and to Melanie Parlett-Stewart from Portage for helping us get all of this organized. We look forward to sharing the results of the next surveys with you in the future, but we'll maybe give that maybe a year or so. Put this on your calendar for next year. We'll do another one. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, keep smiling, and we will see you all in person soon, I hope.